appreciate that introduction, Ben, and I'm really happy to join everybody here this afternoon. I'm so glad to see a full room and to see your enthusiasm for going into our classrooms. I really think that this is one of the most valuable services that the bar provides. Certainly our legal expertise and our advocacy and counseling skills are very well suited to our clients and the issues facing our community. But I really do think that reaching into our community on a deeper level to our youngsters and our next generation of lawyers and judges to emphasize for them the value of their civic education is really one of the most profound things that we do as members of the bar. So to see collectively a group of us coming together to really embrace that and to really lend some time and effort and energy toward this, I think is really lovely. We actually have over 200 lawyers already volunteered for the program. We're almost reaching 300 classrooms this year with this program, which is tremendous. We are statewide. We're in almost every school district at this point across the state, which is really lovely that we're reaching beyond just the Salt Lake Valley, and we're reaching beyond just a few classrooms to really emphasize what we do as bar members every day, but also what the students can do to contribute to the rule of law in our communities. And that's really part of the message that I hope you will take into the classroom. In addition to what we'll discuss today about the lesson planning that we have for you, we'd really like you to mentor some of the skills that these youngsters are gaining as part of being both in their schools and in their homes and in their communities as civically engaged citizens. We really think that they have something to contribute regardless of their age. So you'll notice, for example, we're even going into elementary school classrooms beyond secondary classrooms this year. And we're hoping also that you can provide for them a little glimpse about what education has meant to you. You have a very credible voice with these youngsters, sometimes even more credible, I suspect, than their teachers and their parents, right? We hear the message every day from those of us around us about certain things we should do, and I think the message is the same with these youngsters. You know it from your own children. You can say the same thing to them 2 or 3 times, and they might just nod or say, yeah, and that's as far as the conversation goes. But when someone can really tap their interest or their passion or something that sparks a curiosity with them, it's so different to hear that same message from another person or a new voice. And perhaps you can be that for those youngsters. Think about it, that there may be some in the class who don't know any lawyers or judges, but are thinking perhaps of a career in the law somehow. And you might be their first touchstone for that interest and that passion. So the idea that you can give them a little glimpse of your career path, talk to them a little bit about what education has meant to you, that really as lawyers, one of the most gifted parts of our profession is that we are lifelong learners, that we constantly are studying. The idea that we're always learning new things and being challenged to learn new things and put ourselves out there in a way perhaps that we didn't conceive of our role originally when we went to law school as a lawyer, but that's a possibility for us. I think that's a really great awakening for youngsters to tap into and to say to them, it's possible that you can still do this long from now. If the social studies really turns you on and makes you think about things in a new way and interests you long term, there are certainly ways to apply that. There are certainly professions that call upon that passion, and keep learning along those lines. Keep finding ways to make yourself more civically engaged. I think that's a really valuable voice that you can share with the students as part of your teaching. So how many of you have had the opportunity to register already and know what classroom you're visiting? Great. Is there anybody who has not had an opportunity to visit the bar's website? If you haven't, on the handout for today at the bottom, there is the link provided there for you, the address, so that you can go and register and pick your specific classroom to visit. By raise of hands, how many of you are visiting elementary school classrooms? Great. And then the rest of you, I suspect, secondary classrooms, junior high and senior high school in combination. Yes? Okay. One of the things that you will note is that class size is different than what you might anticipate. When we went to school, class sizes were slightly smaller, in the 20s, maybe reaching into the 30s. You might find a classroom of 40 plus students. There was a woman in the class last night who was discussing that she has been invited to a second grade classroom, but she has been asked to speak in 1 hour to 75 second graders. And that's kind of phenomenal. 7-year-old little wiggly bodies, 75 of them, to try to wrangle and get your arms around and reach with a substantive message. That can be a real challenge, I think. So contemplate planning ahead and reading your lesson plans early, thinking that through now. If you have questions or concerns about the classroom you're visiting or any feedback you're getting from the teacher that may not mesh with your idea from the lesson plan, don't hesitate to reach out to the Civics Committee. We'd be more than happy to offer to you a concrete suggestion of how to either tackle the issue or how to reach back out to the teacher and give them an appropriate resource beyond what you're bringing to the classroom with this one lesson. Does that make sense? Okay, good. For those of you who are dealing with the elementary lesson, I'm going to give a short overview. And for those of you who are in secondary classrooms, this may provide you some alternative ideas to what's presented in the secondary lesson about things you can do with the students. The elementary lesson is not substantively different. That may surprise you to think that you would take to 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders a largely similar lesson to what you might give to senior high school students. And yet the civics concepts are certainly related, and these are ideas about the 3 branches and the rule of law that even younger students can really embrace and start to get their arms around. So we've really not changed it a great deal, other than the fact that the focus of the elementary lesson is a trial process, whereas the secondary lesson is an appellate process. And it's just intended to kind of challenge the students to think slightly differently, right? The assumption is that secondary students will have seen TV and movies and seen the legal process through the eyes of a trial, and this will challenge them to go one step further and contemplate what appellate rights someone would have through the system, as well as to understand the system more fully, that trials are not the only way that we resolve disputes, and that, for example, trials may not always give, quote-unquote, the right or final result, that there are issues that sometimes go beyond that in terms of what a community needs to do to respond, even having the legislature step back in, for example, to potentially correct an issue of law. So the elementary lesson really is only shifted in that it focuses on a trial process rather than appellate rights. But that elementary lesson really does one other thing that I think is really valuable for those of you who are teaching in secondary schools to contemplate, which is really challenge the creative thinking of the students. Both lesson plans give a 15-word vocabulary lesson. The elementary school lesson really isn't super concrete about those terms, but really asks you to kind of allude to them, to use them properly, to ask if there are questions, or if there are words that are unfamiliar that the students let you know so you can pause and then define a term. The definitions are very concrete in the secondary lesson plan, so for those of you teaching in elementary school, if you're challenged to generate a decent definition of something, or you want to have a list with you, there is that concrete defined list in the secondary lesson plan. But what I will challenge you to do if you are in an elementary school to think about is to really give an example from real life. Make the terms as concrete as possible for the youngsters, rather than defining the 3 branches as simply the executive, legislative, and judicial branches and alluding to them with their responsibilities from the articles in the Constitution. Maybe talk through how lots of machines and lots of things in nature have multiple parts that have to work together. For example, I was talking with a social studies teacher recently who sort of gave me a clue about an idea with youngsters talking through, there are 3 parts to every apple, right? The core, the flesh, and the apple peel. And all 3 parts are necessary for the apple to do what the apple is intended to do in nature and to be what you want it to be. To be its best, it has to have all 3 components. The same way the government has to have all 3 components of the different branches of government kind of working together simultaneously. And sometimes that's seamless, right? Sometimes we don't see the distinctions. And the youngsters won't necessarily know how to tease apart all the discrete roles, but they will know that different people do different things. Different people write a law, then enforce a law, then interpret the law. And they will know that concept. So those are ways that you can give a concrete, objective example so that the youngsters understand the same thing. I think secondary students would respond equally as well, though, to concrete examples. Maybe a sports analogy works well for you, or maybe an example from your parenting, right? We're teaching secondary students the appellate process, so maybe you talk to the students about what it's like in your home when your children go from one parent to another trying to vie for who has the most authority to give them the yes that they're really looking for permission, right? In my house, if my daughter wants to go somewhere, she starts with her dad because she figures it's going to be a pretty quick yes. He doesn't want to hear the long drawn-out story. He doesn't want to hear the details and the logistics. He basically just wants a little bit of time and space, so maybe she can say, hey, Dad, can I go do this? And he'll just go, yes, is what she's sincerely hoping. That it'll just be a quick yes. And when, in fact, it turns out to be a no, she's coming pretty quick on the heels to me. Without much word of the trial record, right? Not too much discussion about having gone to the trial court, but she's headed my way for, hey, do you think I can go here? Do you think I can have a ride and maybe $20? And that's the appellate process in a nutshell. You tried once with one level of authority and you didn't get the response you were hoping for. Maybe you try again. Maybe it's a slightly different argument. Maybe you're focused on something different. Maybe you're delineating something differently. So concrete examples, I think, will help these terms and these concepts come off the page for young people. So as much as you can do that, and perhaps even introduce yourself into the lesson a little bit, the more the class will loosen up. They might ask you some questions, so be prepared for that. I think Q&A is also a really valuable piece of this. So if you want to, encourage the youngsters to come to you with questions. What did you do before you became a lawyer? Did you have any other jobs? Did you ever think you were going to be a lawyer when you were my age? Did you really want to do this? Is this the profession that you feel like you're meant to do, or are you secretly hoping to coach for the NFL one day? All of these funny things that occur to young people and maybe even occur to ourselves and our colleagues, but we just don't take the time to ask. Maybe give them some room to be creative and to ask you these questions and kind of unpack a little bit about what the mystery is of being a lawyer or a judge or having this credential. So the elementary lesson starts really with a creative thinking game that if you do have time or you're invited to a secondary classroom with extended time, some of you will appear in classes that have a block schedule. You might have noticed this, that, for example, one school might have 3 classes that all start at 11:30, and you're only taking one of those, but it seems odd that there'd be 3 classes. Well, maybe there's 3 teachers that teach the same subject. Maybe you're all combining into one large auditorium or something. Maybe there's a block schedule where there's an 11:30 class on Tuesday and also an 11:30 class on Wednesday in a secondary school. So if you have a long extended period of time with the students, an hour and a half, say, you may need to extend what you're talking about. The creative thinking game in the elementary school lesson is a great way to do that. It's a great tool for those of you appearing in a secondary class to have something in your arsenal to bring out if you need to fill some time. But it's also a wonderful start for these youngsters because it challenges them to think about where they encounter the law in everyday life. Right? We all know that as soon as we wake up in the morning, we're encountering ways that the law sort of enters our life and governs what we do and how we interact with other people. But maybe youngsters haven't contemplated it the same way. So this paperclip game basically asks the students to think about the value of rules, the value of structure, fairness, what constitutes being fair to one another in a competitive environment, maybe things that they need to know about being good students and good citizens in their school, but also, I think, being good and contributing citizens to their community. And it really challenges you to debrief the game and ask them some good questions about the ways they see the law in real life. So how do they know that there's laws in their home? How do they know beyond what mom and dad say, right? About it's not please and thank you, that's the law, but it may be how you use your home computer that teaches you that there are laws beyond your house, that there's authority beyond your parents. Right? So there are examples that you can give to them. You can talk to them about how they download files for their iPod, right? That's certainly an interaction that they would have with the law. You'd be shocked to learn how many of them are carrying cell phones or smartphones at their young age and know exactly how to use them. How they use those pieces of technology responsibly is certainly governed by the law. So that may be an entry point for you to give them some concrete examples about that. The elementary school lesson also envisions that the classroom itself will be set up as a courtroom, and that you can really talk to the students about the prosecutor in a criminal case or the plaintiff in a civil case would sit here, and this is the role they play, and the defense would sit here in the courtroom, and this is the witness stand, and when you serve as a witness, your responsibility is to tell the truth from your perspective, and that might differ from another person who comes in to talk about things from their own point of view, but you don't get to argue back with that person. That's not your goal. Your goal is to just speak the truth from your point of view and to answer the questions that you're given to the best of your ability. and that you would say an oath to tell the truth, and that we do that in a courtroom on purpose. But we ask people to swear on their honor, on their own code. Tell the truth if you can. Sit there and really tolerate the questions that are coming to you. That can be a kind of a scary thing, and that if they're invited, for example, to participate in a case, that they might have to do the same thing, but not to be worried because there's plenty of people out there, including the judge, and you can point out where the judge sits and what the judge's role is, but it is in part to help the witnesses and to protect them and give them a good, fair process to speak their own truth. So there's ways about, I think, instructing the students about where they're sitting that will also help you unpack what you're about to do. Because the elementary school lesson then segues into a courtroom argument. It is not scripted. It is intended that you would be coaching the students and kind of giving them help about how to generate a dialogue in a courtroom about the case of Cinderella and her stepsisters. And the hope is that you just find a fact pattern that's pretty easy to get your arms around fast. That the students would all kind of have a ready knowledge, a working understanding about the story of Cinderella so they could flesh out the charges. But then also to unpack the idea that criminal charges may not match what you think they mean, right? The definition of cruelty and meanness, according to the kingdom where Cinderella is being tried, might not match your definition of cruelty and meanness. So if you sit on the jury, you're held to a particular standard of decision making that might be different than your own original assumption about facts, and that's really what a trial is intended to be, so that you can talk to the students really about the different people and the different roles in the courtroom and kind of have them work both in smaller groups, right? Maybe there's 3 or 4 of them that serve as the prosecution and 3 or 4 that serve as the defense, so they can work both in small groups but then as a full class to kind of unpack the idea of this mock courtroom argument. Does that make sense? Are there any questions from those of you who are going into elementary classrooms, or even those of you headed to secondary classrooms about something I've said, or a tip that you're looking for in relationship to some part of the teaching? Okay, let's transition then to discussing the secondary lesson. And that secondary lesson is really broken into 2 parts. And the first part is focusing on vocabulary. That 15-word vocabulary list is given to you in a lot of detail. I mean, you'll find that almost the first half of the packet is really spent on the terminology that we use as lawyers to discuss the branches of government, the separation of powers between them, how they interact with one another most effectively, and why there is an independent judiciary. And really that's the goal of this lesson, is to teach the secondary students why we have a judiciary that functions the way that it does to interpret the law. Why are we, for example, in Utah, not electing judges outright? Why are we not having judges campaign for their office, for example? That there is a distinction in Utah between a retention election and a campaign. So maybe unpacking that for students. For those of you particularly going to senior high school classes, some of those students will be registering to vote and maybe participating in a retention election. And they certainly may have heard their parents discuss a retention election. And people say casual things like, oh, I see all the judges and I just check yes, or I just check no, without a real understanding, a working knowledge of why it's important to be informed about the judges and their role and the distinction between the court systems. That's the other piece of this lesson, really, is to delineate the difference between a trial court and an appellate court, and to signify for the students why they should know the difference. How to be an educated consumer, for example, about news articles on the courts, right? That the Supreme Court does something different than a trial court, that they're asking a different question entirely than what you might think is the pertinent question in an issue. So it's a good lesson plan about being an educated consumer of the judiciary, but also maybe telling them that there's internships in the judiciary for students, that there's opportunities for students of all ages and civic groups and scouting groups to visit the court system, that you can go and observe. You need not be a party to a case, for example, to watch a trial. That might be a completely new idea to someone. So maybe you can unpack some of those different myths and different assumptions about the court system and give these students an opportunity to get to know what we do and where we work a little more effectively. That vocabulary lesson is really intended also to be something that you can choose how you deliver it in terms of how you teach or talk about the vocabulary. It can be a simple conversation, Or if you want to have a more interactive class, you can play that matching game, right? Break up the definitions and the terms and hand them to different students around the classroom and see who can match their definition to the appropriate vocabulary term best. And who knows what, right? Maybe even challenge some of their sources of information, right? I saw Law and Order and I'm pretty sure the definition is X. That probably isn't the best source of information on how to define a legal term. So maybe we should unpack that a little bit for you, and let's see maybe what your civics book has to say, or maybe what your colleagues around the room have to say, right? More than one person might have a definition for a term. So that's a good way of getting the entire classroom involved. Some interactivity between sides of the room, some interactivity between students who typically would answer questions and maybe some students who are more quiet, eliciting a more full participation experience for the students. So there's both options in terms of how to present that best to the classroom. Then the lesson segues really to the heart of what you're there to discuss, and it's the fact pattern on Liberty City, which is an issue of how laws are written, how laws are enforced, and then how laws are interpreted. And it gives you three distinct parties to the case, right? The appellant, the appellee, and then the judges who are serving as the decision makers in the appellate issue. And what I will say to you is that you may even challenge other folks to get involved. If you have a large classroom, maybe you can delineate some other participants in an appellate case. You might talk about a special interest group who would try to file with either side a brief or perhaps appear in the courtroom to make their presence known or their particular opinion known. You might even talk about the media and how court cases are covered. There's a series of questions on page 16 of the lesson plan that I will really encourage you to become familiar with. It is a list of debrief questions that I think will be incredibly valuable for those of you in a secondary classroom so that you can really have a full-fledged discussion with the students about what they know about judges potentially making law from the bench, right? A concept that's sort of always discussed in the news when appellate cases are covered. Whether or not a judge makes law, whether or not a judge can make the law, what can a judge do to influence how a law might change, right? Giving suggestions perhaps in a written opinion to the legislature, or tipping a nod to the idea that the law only exists in these parameters and I can only do so much to resolve this issue, but maybe if I had some help from the legislature looking at an issue anew, maybe I could do something different, or maybe there's another possibility, right, for citizens to get involved on the tail end of a case. So talk to the students through some of those complex and more subtle questions. Allow them some room to be creative and to dig into some of these issues and to talk with you about this concrete example of Liberty City in those terms. One of the really lovely pieces of the social studies curriculum in the secondary classroom is that it's not only emphasizing social studies facts and figures, but it also emphasizes things like life skills. What does it mean to do your citizenship, to enact it, to engage it fully? So how do you do that as a citizen? And one of the skill sets that's emphasized right now for our students in secondary social studies classrooms is a writing skill set, right? How to put your opinion on paper, how to be persuasive in writing, how to even communicate that fully, how you feel about something, how to give evidence about why you feel the way you do, and what challenges you about an issue. So maybe you want to allow the students some time to do some writing. Did you think the trial court in the Liberty City case was right or wrong? Was that decision fair? Was the sentence reasonable? If it wasn't, was it good that there was an appeal? Did you like appealing the case? Was it hard to keep your mouth shut when it wasn't your turn to argue back or not to bring a witness for your point of view? Is that a challenge? To contemplate the role of judges, right? To sit in judgment of a case that's already been decided by someone's peers and to evaluate that information. Is that a challenge for you? Is that difficult? Could you sit in judgment of another person, either at the trial or the appellate court level? So allowing some of those debrief questions to even become a reflective writing process may also be something good for you to do or to suggest to the teacher to do as a follow-up. We will be communicating with all of the teachers, giving them tips for how to prepare for your visits, both at the elementary and the secondary level, as well as giving them some concrete suggestions for how to follow up, to continue to incorporate your messages into their curriculum, to do so through media, through video, through historic speeches, historic documents, as well as how to do that through reading lists or book lists for youngsters. So we will follow up with them concretely, but some of these suggestions and offering some writing assignments may very well make a good use of your skill set as a lawyer, right? That's one of the primary focuses that we have for our clients, is to not only delineate what we think verbally, but to do so in writing and to do so effectively. And so to help these youngsters engage that skill set, I think is a really great use of your own expertise. Are there any questions about the secondary lesson, or? Yes, please.
I emailed the teacher that will be, that I'll be teaching for.
Yes.
And have not received a response.
Okay.
Is that common, or
How long has been the duration?
3 days?
Well, this is the start of school, so it's a possibility that the teacher's sort of bombarded. But if it were me, I would check in one more time. I might also check in with the Civics website to make sure your classroom is really the one to which you are assigned, to be clear that you have the right teacher and the right time, just to make sure that on the schedule you see that yours is blocked out and that you're communicating with the appropriate person. If you run into a problem where you're not able to get any response, you can certainly contact the committee and we can try to reach out to that teacher as well to just ensure you make a connection before going. One other connection that will be very important for you to make at the school, particularly at the elementary school level, will be a stop in the main office regardless of what school you visit. And your teachers may not think to emphasize this because it's become so commonplace for them, but you really need to afford yourself a few extra minutes to go to the main office and get a visitor's guest pass. For an elementary school, it will be a physical object that will identify you. It may be a badge you wear beyond just a visitor sticker. And it's really important to the security of the schools, as well as to maintaining for the students some sort of commonality that all their guests wear, those yellow lanyards or something. So give yourself a few extra minutes to do that at the front end of your visit, beyond communicating with the teacher ahead of time. There was a hand over here. Yes, please.
You said to go back in and check to make sure the school we chose is actually going to sign.
Yes?
How do we do that? I signed up for the school, I went back in, and then I noticed that school, that hour is no longer there.
Okay, that will also show you that you've blocked out the time if you clicked on it and it no longer appears on the public page. You can also look, you should be able to get the contact information immediately from your school to show you who you're communicating with and how many students are in that classroom. You should get feedback about that. If you did not get that, if you thought you clicked on a school and you did not receive that feedback, that's your clue that you're not fully registered. So there were a couple of folks last night who clicked on a school and highlighted it and thought that had registered them, but they had no further communication about the details. So once you obtain that information, you're assured that the system has linked you to that appointment. There were two other hands, please.
Slight similar. I did booked up for both of us 2 back-to-back classes, and I got a confirmation for one but not the other.
Okay.
Same teacher, same place.
That should suffice that no one would fill those 2 spots.
And it's off the list. But
As long as it's off the list, then you know that you're confirmed for both.
So if we received a confirmation email?
Yes, then your appointment is now set, but you should be hearing from the teacher. If you're not hearing from the teacher, I might follow up one more time. There's also a school website that will give you a line to phone the teacher. It will be a message line because they'll be instructing their students and won't be able to receive a call. But that might also be a prompt that maybe, hey, I left you this email and I'm coming to your classroom. I haven't heard from you. Maybe you can give me a call back or an email back. Here's my contact information. That's a secondary option. I know email is the most preferred method of communicating with the teachers just because they can do it even when their students are in class on occasion. If the students are working independently, they might be able to respond to a few pieces of their messages, but not to the voicemails typically. So, but that is a great secondary option to reach out. And if you continue to struggle, don't hesitate to let us know to help you out. Yes, please.
The class I'm in is only 50 minutes long. Do you have any suggestions on how to
condense?
Yes.
It's a secondary classroom.
Yeah.
So my suggestion is to really streamline that vocabulary piece. I think that discussion can have a tendency to weigh you down a little bit in the front end and you won't get to the simulation, which I really think is where the meat is. So I would streamline that. I might not make the game as elaborate if I play the game, or if I want to encourage some dialogue back and forth, maybe I'll just list the terms on the board and see if anybody has a definition or can offer me a suggestion about what things might mean, and do it more as a dialogue as opposed to something where you're spending 20 or 25 minutes really interacting at that level, and then still having to try to make up the activity. Because I think the appellate scenario is really lovely and very rich. And if you read the 3 pages of information for the different roles, you'll see there's even prompts at the bottom for each of the 3 roles to kind of gear up for their side of the argument. So to give the students full time to do that, I think is really the best portion of your time spent. Any other questions or comments, concerns about your teaching experience or ideas you have for one another? Then I will also then point out just a couple of other concrete suggestions. Rely on your teachers to choose the roles in the classroom. If at all possible, signal to your teacher ahead of time that they should delineate which students will portray what. One, it will save you from having to be the bad guy of disappointing certain students about who can do what in the classroom. But it also may allow the teacher to quell some discipline issues or to quell some issues about students who may not be as communicative as others. Some will be much more comfortable in front of the class, particularly at the elementary level. Some will be better readers than others and better public speakers than others, and may not want to be, put on the spot where you wouldn't know that by looking at them. You wouldn't be able to say, oh, this student will be a class clown or this student will really struggle and be uncomfortable. So rely on your teachers in that delineation so that you can have as effective a student portrayal of these roles as possible. And then also, I alluded to it earlier, to really leave a little bit of time if at all possible. And I understand in 50 minutes it'll be a challenge, but maybe leave 5 minutes at the tail end for students to just ask you random questions about either cases they've read in the news or something that's going on in current events here in the Valley, or maybe something going on in their school or their community that they care about, that they might want to talk to you about informally. And I think you might be surprised. I think you may also get some really lovely, interesting dialogue started in the classroom, which is a great safe place for these kids to learn to unpack some of these questions that maybe their kitchen table isn't serving as the place for. So if you can open that up, that's great. If you don't get an opportunity, maybe you can leave with the teacher the idea that there may be some current events to talk about or some other issues to deal with the students now based on their experience. That is one of our concrete suggestions, is to have an assignment for the students to either watch the local news or the national news on TV, online, or to get a printed article from a news source to bring in then to talk about what they learned and how they read the article or heard the news report differently as a result of your communication with them. But it might be a great way to start that and to get some creative, kind of interesting questions. Sometimes some surprising questions. I was with a judge recently in a classroom, and the students decided to ask the judge what he had on under his robe, which was interesting because he was wearing shorts and a t-shirt that day. I mean, it was sort of funny that he was standing in front of the class with sneakers on, and I don't think many of the students noticed that he wasn't in dress shoes, but when he unzipped his robe and showed them that he was in shorts and a t-shirt and just kind of a regular guy, I think the students were all sort of stunned and appreciative that he was just a normal person. There was nothing sort of magical about this person other than he's been conferred a real responsibility and a weighty role that he takes seriously. But it was a really funny moment that you can only have with young people, right? We wouldn't think to ask that question, and we certainly wouldn't think to ask the judge to unzip his robe in front of everybody and say, what are you wearing? But, an 8-year-old thought that was a pretty funny thing to say. So it actually led to a nice conversation about the fact that the judge thought he was just a normal person, which is something really that I think the students will be surprised about with all of you too, that there's a great deal of majesty and importance to our role at times, and yet we're all just normal people who, are trying to make a living and do something good with our time and serve our communities in a good way and be of value to our clients and to the colleagues that we work with, but that there was no magic way for us to get into law school, that there was nothing that really sort of greased the wheel for us. It's been hard work. It's been doing what we were supposed to. It's been paying attention to the laws around us and living our life in a certain way and being a certain kind of neighbor and friend and professional that makes our work valuable. So maybe some of those, they might seem like trite lessons, but they might also be very valuable in terms of planting a seed for some of the young people who don't receive that kind of mentoring. So with that said, I will also invite you to participate in the surveys that will come out following your experiences. Give us feedback. Tell us about what you learned, what you liked, what you didn't like, what worked for you, what did not. Even share anecdotes of your successes, because for us, those kinds of things all stack up to build the value and the credibility of this program for the following year. So please, by all means, give us your feedback and send us your ideas, but also be willing to participate with us down the road. Next year, around Law Day, the first week of May, we will be participating with schools again, emphasizing the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta and the drafting of constitutional law for our communities and the value of writing law. And so we'll have some writing lessons for students and another opportunity for lawyers and judges to visit classrooms. So please don't hesitate to get involved with us down the road or to encourage your colleagues who might be busy or in trial now to potentially think about doing that in the future. As well, there's 2 other programs that happen in the spring of 2015. The statewide mock trial competition, as well as the We the People competition, that require over 750 volunteers from the bar to operate, to serve as judges, coaches, team captains, all kinds of things for these students to kind of get ready for these competitions and to participate effectively. So if you can lend your time once again, or if this is a really valuable and satisfying experience for you, there's another way to contribute down the road, and please don't hesitate to seek that out. That's through Utah law-related education. So we would be glad to have you participate with us again. And thank you for your interest in coming both today as well as to visiting your local classrooms. We encourage you to do this more often and to find ways of finding an entry point for your legal career to impact youngsters around you. So thanks for your time and your commitment to this. We really appreciate it. If you have any other questions, I'll be around for just a few minutes, so don't hesitate to stop me.